Hey everybody, this is Ben with Postfly. This month's warm water tying kit features the Crawdad. Its creative use of materials and effectiveness on the water makes this pattern a fun tie and a go-to for all sorts of crustacean-eating species. Start by laying down thread about a quarter of the way down the hook shank for now. We'll add in a set of dumbbell eyes on top of this base. Tie them in about a hook eye's length behind the eye, then make wraps in the opposite direction to straighten them into place. I use two different techniques here to secure the eyes. The first involves wrapping over each end of the eyes and passing your thread under the shank, which binds the material in from above. Here's a top-down view of this motion. Again, we're going over the eyes here and under the shank. After you've done this wrap a bunch of times, start wrapping under the eyes and over the shank. You'll start to see the upper wraps get drawn tighter in around the eyes as you lock them in from below. Here's a top-down view of this technique. When you have a small buildup of thread on both of these wraps, move your bobbin to behind the dumbbell eyes. Apply some head cement to the wraps for extra protection. Grab a 4-inch long strand of weighted wire, snipping it from the rest of the coil with your fingernail. Start wrapping it around the shank just behind the dumbbell eyes. You may need to hold it to the shank at first to get leverage, but once you've wrapped it a few times it should stick on its own. I like to make my first couple of wraps on the threaded portion of the shank to give it some tread. You can add a good amount of wire here. As you can see, I go down to about the halfway point of the shank. All of this weight towards the front of the fly gives the pattern a good bucking action and helps it get down quickly. When you've reached this point on the hook, clip any excess again with your fingernail. Then go back and forth a few times with your thread to secure the whole length of the wrapped wire to the hook. You can add some super glue before laying down the wire for a real strong hold if you'd like, but I've found it's not really necessary. When the wire has some coverage to it, continue laying your thread base down the shank and a bit into the bend of the hook. Then advance your bobbin back up to just behind the hook point. Pull off a sparse clump of the brown dubbing from your kit and begin working it into a thin noodle on your thread. Make wraps from the hook point down to where you stopped adding thread on the bend, forming a small dubbing ball in this section. This will help extend the crayfish body past the claws and eyes we'll be adding next. These grizzly saddle feathers will make up our crayfish claws. Tie in the tips facing rearwards so that they reach about a hook shank in length past the hook bend, and so that they angle out slightly on each side of the fly. By tying in with a few loose wraps at first, you can manipulate the tips to get them into their perfect positions. Tie the butt ends of the feathers down the shank for added durability. Then tie off and snip the excess right behind the dumbbell eyes. Next we'll add some mono eyes. Grab a pair from your kit and snip them in half right where the stalks separate from each other. Add them in one at a time so that the eyeball portion rests about halfway out from your claws. As you did with the saddle hackle, tie the butt ends of the eyes down the shank and snip off near the dumbbells. Secure tightly to ensure the slippery plastic is bound in well. Take a thin strand of monofilament from your kit and cut off a 6-inch long section. The line gets a little coiled in the bag, but if you run it through your fingers slowly and tightly, the heat will straighten it out and make the material easier to work with. This trick also works for your leaders when fishing too. Tie in one end of the mono so that the main length faces rearwards, and leave it for now. Take a third saddle hackle feather and separate the upper section at about the halfway point in the feather. The fibers here are the correct proportions for the legs of our crayfish when we add them. Add the split feather in the same way you did the mono by having it face rearwards. With your mono and final hackle staged up, bring your thread back to behind the dumbbell eyes. Go back to your dubbing and create another noodle around your thread. Wrap backwards to meet your other dubbing ball from earlier to close off all exposed thread. Then, begin building a larger dubbing body at the bend of the hook by layering your wraps on top of each other. Imagine the profile of a crayfish, with a thicker head near the eyes and claws and a thinner tail. Taper this fatter section of dubbing as you wrap back towards the dumbbell eyes like so, adding more dubbing as needed. When you've returned to your dumbbell eyes, let your bobbin hang. Grab the rear-facing hackle feather from earlier and begin wrapping it towards the front of the hook. Prioritize your wraps around the back third section of the shank. Don't worry about getting the front as well since this will be trimmed back later. A pair of hackle pliers can also be helpful when wrapping this shortened feather. When you've reached your thread, tie off and snip the excess. Then follow with your monofilament ribbing, counter-wrapping it to the same point. Trim the excess here too. Now it's time to grab your whip finisher. Make 3 to 4 turns and clip your thread free, but hold on to those scissors. The purpose of the hackle fibers is to imitate the crayfish legs just behind the claws. Since the fly will ride hook point up, we need to trim back everything except the back third of the hackle on top of the hook shank. You can't add anything else at this stage, so trim carefully to ensure you don't overdo it. By the end of your haircut, the fly should look something like this. You can also kind of crush the remaining hackle down so that it angles back correctly. To give the body more of a buggy look, I like to brush the dubbing out a bit with some Velcro. This helps free some of the matted down fibers and fills out the body a little more when wet. Finally, grab some UV resin or head cement and coat the whip finish area, the wraps around the dumbbell eyes, and the thread base at the front of the shank. This concludes our Crawdad tutorial. As mentioned earlier, this pattern will ride upside down with the hook point up. Fish this one on the bottom around rocks and wood structure using slow crawls or hard strips. Bass and trout won't be able to get enough. Thanks for watching.